Hello everybody. It's a bit of a strange event for me to end the conference, so I will try and keep you going for the evening and prepare you for the gin and tonic that's coming. I want to start by looking at what we mean by welfare, the current state of welfare, and where we are, where we can go in terms of welfare beyond the state. And this is really a very contemporary debate. It's a very now debate, and it's one that as classical liberals we are almost entirely absent from. And I want to say that I think we ought to get into the debate, because we are now at a point where there's a real opportunity that we can fundamentally reduce the scope of the state when it comes to welfare. One of the challenges in this is that there are many different definitions, and they all are developed by people who are welfare statists. So they are all developed by people who have an overwhelmingly positive view of the role of the state, who are completely blind to policy and programme failure, and who generally, when you talk about welfare reform, will accuse you of being the devil incarnate and will completely refuse to engage. And several academics define the welfare state as an ideal type in which the state is redistributing from the rich to the poor and ensuring a guarantee of basic incomes and providing support against insecurities. It's often used as a critique of liberalism and of neoliberalism. And sometimes it's often used as a form of governance, the idea that the welfare state is how governance should be run, and it's the purpose of government to do that. Now we might take a bit of an expansive view and look at health, work about the environment, education, welfare benefits, the national minimum wage, all of these things as being part of the welfare state. I'm going to focus very much on welfare benefits in this discussion. And indeed, another part of the challenge here is that there are many, many different flavours of welfare state around the world. So not coming from a classical liberal point of view, Epstein-Anderson talks about there being 3 different types of welfare state. He puts us in the UK very firmly in the liberal, in which the welfare state provides a minimum means-tested level of guarantee, which when I go on to the next slide you will question. And while criticised, I think this points out that there are not only differences between welfare states, but also welfare states change over time, which adds to the complexity. Now, welfare provision, I'm going to argue, has been a fundamental part of human society for all time, and not just provision by the state, but provision between us as human beings. And the current state is largely a creation of the latter part of the 19th century, with the liberal governments in the early part of the 20th century getting on board, and then a massive development in the post-war period. So I think it's worth putting a little bit of context on this. The UK state last year spent £1.2 trillion. That's the equivalent of £42,000 per household. At 46.2% of GDP, that's the 3rd highest level in terms of GDP since 1948. And that's before last week's budget. The state spends almost £250 million on welfare benefits. Most of that is spent on pensions and on working age benefits. That spend has gone up in absolute terms and as a relative share of government spending over the last 25 years. 1.8 million working age adults get 80% of their income from the state. But half of all working age adults get some of their income from the state. And over the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of the working poor. People who are working but have their income topped up on a regular basis through the benefit system. And some parts of the benefit system have grown faster than others. Housing benefit, for example, has doubled in size since the 1990s. One piece of my empirical research was looking at the most recent reform of housing benefit in 2008. And following that reform, not only did, which basically centralised decisions about how much housing benefit would be paid to cover levels of rent, and was intended to incentivise people who were on housing benefit to move around. But following that reform, not only did the number of housing benefit claimants go up, but also there was a very, very strong positive correlation between housing benefit claimants and homelessness. So basically that reform led to more homeless families in the UK. And one of the things that's happened over the last 20 years as well, there's been a growth in people in their 20s and 30s who have low qualifications, who are coming out of school, never working, and being on health-related benefits. And they tend to be concentrated in particular parts of the UK, so particularly seaside towns. You will find huge concentrations of people in their 20s and 30s who have never worked, who have always been on benefits, and who are on health-related benefits. And arguably, there's been a change in vision, or at least a change in the way that these programs are delivered over the last 50 years or so. From an idea, the Beveridge report, of providing time-limited support when people really, really needed it, to providing means-tested, regardless of any contribution that people have made into the system, means-tested support that people can access on a permanent basis. And that has driven policy over the last 20 or 30 years. Now, those welfare statists who write about the welfare state talk about the welfare state being in crisis, and they've been talking about this since the 1970s. And the current crisis is about the sustainability and affordability of the welfare state. And that's driven by a number of things. The first thing is the ageing population. So those people on pensions are increasing in absolute terms, in terms of numbers, but also increasing relative to the working age population. So just as the pensions bill goes up, the number of people working who can pay taxes to pay that pension bill is going down. And bear in mind that of that £250 billion that's being spent on welfare, national insurance only generates 170 billion. So it doesn't generate enough money to pay the benefits bill, let alone for everything else. The second thing you'll see in the literature is this idea that climate change will inevitably have an effect. The idea that the transition to net zero necessitates low or no growth. And historically, it's been economic growth that's allowed the welfare state to grow. And therefore, the idea is, if the transition to net zero stops growth from happening, what implications does that have for the future of the welfare state? And then, there are the implications of the lockdown. So this is a chart from ONS data that shows the level of economically inactive working age people who are inactive because of some health condition. And as you can see, over a great deal of time, there was a gradual decline in the number of people who are economically inactive because of health conditions, because of various welfare reforms that were done from the mid-1990s onward. You can then see the beginning of the lockdown. And what we've seen since the lockdowns has been a massive increase in people claiming working age benefits because of health-related instances. An extra 2.9 million people are now doing that, with a total of 9.4 million people being economically inactive. The cost of that to the Treasury is massive. But it's also a massive cost to the people involved. Because Richard Turnbull was talking earlier on about the benefits of working and the role that work plays in civil society and in our society. But we also need to look at the role that worklessness plays. Because overwhelmingly, worklessness is bad for your physical health, it's bad for your mental health, it is bad for your financial security and your social security. If you are out of work for more than 6 months, you are something like 5 times more likely to be in poor health. You are something like 7 times more likely to smoke, and all of the health implications that are related to smoking come down at you, and largely that is because of the stress of being out of work. And so it's really important when we're talking about social justice and we're talking about the welfare system to think about social justice for welfare recipients, because the damage that is caused to people who are long-term worklessness is massive, it's significant, and it's hugely costly, not least to the NHS. So I want to now talk a little bit about welfare without the state. And as will, I'm sure, be very obvious, I am not a political theorist. My understanding of classical liberalism is very much heartfelt rather than based in my academic research. But for me, civil society is a really important part of my classical liberalism. And that isn't about me saying that I think there is a particular type of civil society that is better than another type, or that we as citizens should act in a certain way in civil society. But nevertheless, civil society, we as human beings, we're social animals, we talk to each other, we exchange with each other in markets, but also socially. Civil society is fundamentally important. And David Green, in a really fascinating book in the early 90s, talked about the lived reality of the welfare before the welfare state, and focused that very much on voluntary organisations and voluntary associations. So for me, really importantly, civil society is about voluntary associations. Voluntary association good, involuntary association often not quite so good. And he talked about this huge network of friendly societies, of trade unions, of cooperatives, of mutual aid societies, of credit unions, providing a welfare system that provided basic support to people when they most needed it before the creation of the welfare state. And then from 1911 onwards, the state started to co-opt that system, to take it over. First of all, by making those organisations run national insurance and the programmes that were funded out of it, and then in 1948, abolishing that system and completely transferring it to the state. And we saw in that period this decimation of those voluntary associations and those voluntary organisations. So, what does that mean for now? Well, a lot of my research, I do policy evaluation research, and I'm particularly interested in what non-state voluntary associations work well for delivering welfare and for delivering social justice. So a lot of my research is around homelessness and the role that charities play in addressing homelessness. I also write about social impact bonds and the way that we can use entrepreneurship to generate social impact. But today I want to talk about volunteering, because for me volunteering is a fundamental part of civil society. And volunteering is a form of mutual support. It's a way that we as human beings exchange with each other for mutual benefit. We do so through reciprocity. We do so not expecting the person that we're helping to immediately give something back, but that over time, what we give in, we will get back according to whatever level of need that we have. And there's in the literature, there are two types of volunteering. Formal volunteering, which is done through an organisation, a charity or a society, and then informal, which is not organised, and it's the kind of stuff that we do for our families and friends. Now, volunteering has massive human and social capital benefits. It has human capital benefits to the individuals who volunteer. It improves their social networks, their social connectivity. It's amazingly good at preventing and tackling dementia and Alzheimer's. It has huge human benefits. It also has social capital benefits in terms of social networks, in terms of the recipients of volunteering. And for me, volunteering is a fundamental part and a fundamental necessity for welfare beyond the state. Now, in the literature, there's a lot of discussion about two concepts called crowding out and crowding in. And it won't be a surprise to you that those of us on the classical liberal side will talk about crowding out, and those welfare statists will talk about crowding in. So crowding out is the idea that as welfare states get bigger, our voluntary relationships and associations with each other diminish. The welfare statists argue that as the welfare state gets bigger, you find more voluntary associations and more volunteering, etc. But actually, the evidence is a lot more mixed than those two arguments would suggest. And it's a lot more mixed because crowding out does happen, and it happens where the state is directly competing with those voluntary associations. So where the state takes over a function, it does indeed crowd out. Where the state is complementing voluntary association, it doesn't crowd out, it tends to crowd in. And even more complex, it is formal volunteering where this happens, but informal volunteering is unaffected by the level of the welfare state. So whatever the welfare state does, we still look after our family and friends, but if the welfare state is competing with us, we don't engage directly in formal volunteering opportunities. And that, for me, poses a really important question, and it's one that you two would be better at answering than me, which is, if increasing welfare provision crowds out voluntary association, if we reduce the welfare state, will that inevitably mean that voluntary associations and volunteering will grow again? It's an important question because it's an important question that we need to be able to answer if we're making the classical liberal point for welfare beyond the state. Now, this is not without its challenges. So I've just posed one, but we are seeing some generational effects in terms of levels of volunteering. And these generational effects are really starting to come in at the moment. Older people are more likely to volunteer, and younger people less likely to volunteer. But what we are seeing is that people in my age and younger are not growing their volunteering as they get older. And whether that is because of the growth of the welfare state, I would think it is, that people have got used to going, the state does it, we don't need to contribute. But it is having quite a significant effect on the charitable sector. Coupled with the fact that lockdowns have completely decimated volunteering. Those people who were volunteering before lockdowns have not returned. And that's been coupled with a massive reduction in charitable giving and also a increase in demand for charitable services. The charitable sector in this country and in many other countries is facing a triple challenge at the moment. And the question really is whether that's going to sort itself out and we're going to go back to a more normal position. The other challenge is that your likelihood of volunteering is predicted by two things. It's predicted by your experience of volunteering, either your personal experience or your family's experience, and opportunities to volunteer. And unfortunately, both of those two tend to be concentrated in richer areas. So one of the personal challenges that I find when I'm talking about volunteering is how do we ensure that people who live in more deprived areas, the very people who would benefit most out of volunteering, get the experience and the opportunities to do so. And that for me is a real social justice question. It's not one, obviously, that I think the state can address. I think it's one that voluntary associations at the lower level need to address and need to deal with. So, finally, as I said, you can tell I'm not a political theorist because I'm talking about quite different things. And one of the challenges for me as a classical liberal doing empirical research around welfare reform is that everybody else is a welfare statist. Everybody else has a really positive view of the welfare state, and they are blind to policy and programme failure. But the welfare state does have a number of unintended and negative consequences. I've talked about the crowding out, and for me, that move to involuntary association and the crowding out of voluntary association is in of itself enough to challenge the welfare state. But more importantly, I've also talked about the harm that can be done out of worklessness, and particularly if that worklessness is incentivized by a welfare benefit system, which there is growing evidence that it is. And because the welfare state is in this crisis situation, I think there is a real opportunity for us now to put forward a positive, proactive case, for a classical liberal case for welfare without the state, beyond the state. I don't think that realistically is going to be welfare without the state, but a rebalancing of the welfare state to encourage and involve more voluntary associations, more volunteering, more self-reliance, I think, is the only realistic way we can deal with those challenges to the welfare state that I talked about.